There comes a moment in your life where you stop begging for breadcrumbs from people who feast on your desperation. When the anxious stops chasing the avoidant, a war ends, not the war with them, the war with yourself. Because let's be real, this wasn't love. It was a battlefield of wounds dancing with wounds. You are being held. You are being hooked. And every time you reached out, texted first, apologized first, bent your truth to avoid abandonment, you weren't chasing love. You were chasing survival. You weren't chasing love. You were chasing survival. Read that again. Let it stab a little. Because if you're honest, deep down, you knew it wasn't love. Not the kind that sees you, hears you, holds you when you're hurting. What you were chasing was safety, validation, certainty, a place to finally exhale and feel like you mattered. But instead, what you got was silence after vulnerability. Mixed signals dressed as mystery, moments of connection followed by cold withdrawals that made your nervous system scream, and you called it chemistry. It wasn't chemistry, it was cortisol. It was anxiety, it was your trauma trying to finish a story that started long before they entered your life. Let's cut through the fluff. You weren't texting them just to check in. You were panicking. You were trying to get ahead of rejection. You were trying to control the uncontrollable so you didn't have to relive that old familiar heartbreak, the one that's been living under your skin since childhood. And every time they pulled away, every time they said, I just need space, or I'm not ready, it wasn't just disappointment, it was devastation. Because their absence felt like proof that you're unlovable, proof that you're always too much or not enough. You didn't want them. You wanted to prove to yourself that someone like that, someone who avoids, who shuts down, who runs, could choose you, because if they did, maybe it would finally mean you're worth it. That's not love. That's emotional survival. You shaped yourself to fit their cracks. You twisted your voice, tiptoed around your truth, softened your needs just to be understandable, just to not scare them off. You called it compromise, but it was self-erasure. You weren't holding space for them. You were disappearing one anxious thought at a time. Did I say too much? Should I wait a little longer before replying? I probably overreacted. Maybe I'm the problem. And suddenly, you're not even in a relationship. You're in a mental hostage situation where your inner child is begging for someone to just stay. And you're anxiously attached. You don't fall in love. You fall into patterns. You don't bond, you cling. You overthink every text, analyze every pause, replay every interaction like a crime scene, because you're not trying to build a connection, you're trying to prevent abandonment. And no one told you this, but you need to hear it loud. That wasn't your fault. You learned to survive by reading the emotional weather of the room. You learned to stay connected by abandoning yourself first before someone else could do it for you. You learned to please, to perform, to prove, because somewhere along the way, someone made you feel like you had to earn love. And now here you are, an adult, playing out the same damn cycle, chasing people who pull away, staying up all night wondering what you did wrong, pretending you're okay with crumbs just to not be alone. But you were never too much. You were never asking for too much. You were asking the wrong person. You were asking someone emotionally constipated to hold space for your bigness. You were asking someone running from their own feelings to validate yours. You were asking someone who hides in silence to give you peace. But how can a storm calm the waves? You were surviving, not loving. And survival mode will always choose familiarity over freedom. It will pick a cold shoulder over a warm heart if that cold shoulder feels like home. The moment you realize that your nervous system is mistaking chaos for passion, that's when you wake up. That's when you stop chasing. That's when you stop waiting for the avoidant to finally turn around and meet you in the middle. Even if they did choose you, even if they stayed, you'd still be anxious because it was never about them. It was always about that wound inside of you, the one screaming, please prove to me I'm not disposable, but they can't. They won't, because it's not their job. It's yours. When you chase someone who avoids intimacy, you're actually avoiding yourself, avoiding your pain, avoiding your loneliness, avoiding that deep void that says, I don't feel safe unless someone else wants me. But what if instead of chasing someone who avoids you, you started chasing yourself, your truth, your power, your peace? What if you let yourself sit in the discomfort, the shaking, trembling loneliness and said, even if no one texts me back, I am enough. Even if they never choose me, I choose myself. Even if I feel abandoned, I will not abandon me. You weren't chasing love. You were chasing the part of you that was still waiting for someone to rescue you, and now the rescue mission is over. Because the only person who can meet that anxious, trembling heart is the you who's done begging, the you who's done bleeding, the you who's done shrinking to be digestible, the you who's no longer chasing ghosts in hopes of becoming whole. You weren't chasing love, you were chasing survival, and now you're ready to live. You cannot heal in the arms of someone who keeps dropping you. That sentence should punch you in the chest because it's not poetic, it's a warning. You keep reaching for comfort in the very place that causes your pain. You keep crawling back to hands that only know how to let go. You tell yourself this time will be different, but every time you open yourself, they vanish again. Emotionally, physically, spiritually, like clockwork. And still you stay, still you try, still you hope. Why? Because you've mistaken effort for connection. You think that just because you feel something deeply, it must be real. But intensity is not intimacy. Obsession is not love. Anxiety is not chemistry. And abandonment is not a test you have to pass to prove your worth. Some of you are lying to yourselves. You're calling it healing when really it's just coping in chaos. You're saying they're triggering my growth, but you're not growing. You're bleeding and you're calling the blood roses. Let's stop the fantasy right here. This is not a fairy tale. This is not star-crossed lovers. This is trauma reenactment on loop. You're not healing. You're hoping they'll change, and that hope is killing your soul slowly. You want to heal? Then stop going back to the scene of the crime. Stop bringing your vulnerable heart into a space where it gets shattered every time you open it. You cannot rebuild yourself in a war zone. And some of you, let's be honest, are addicted to the war, addicted to the push and pull, addicted to the drama, because at least drama feels like something. At least the highs are high, right? But then come the lows, the gut-wrenching, tear-stained, I can't eat lows. And still, you crawl back like a soldier who forgot the war is already lost. Stop calling it love. It's wounding. It's self-abandonment in disguise. You show up with your full heart, and they show up with a wall, and then you blame yourself when you bounce off it again and again. You write off your needs as too much. You label your emotions dramatic. You minimize your truth just to keep them from pulling away. But here's the brutal truth. If they loved you the way you love them, you wouldn't be feeling this way. Because love doesn't leave you guessing. Love doesn't gaslight your reality. Love doesn't punish your vulnerability with silence. Love doesn't make you beg for presents. If you have to chase, it's not love. It's survival mode dressed in romantic fantasy. Some of you were taught to believe that suffering means it's real, that if it hurts, it must be worth it. But let me tell you something. Real love feels like peace, not panic. Real love doesn't raise your anxiety, it heals it. Real love doesn't teach you to walk on eggshells. It gives you solid ground to stand on. So why do you stay? Why do you keep trying? Because deep inside, there's a child who thinks, maybe if I just love them right, they won't leave. But that child has been abandoned enough. That child has waited long enough. That child deserves a protector, and that protector is you. Not them. Not someone who disappears when it gets hard. Not someone who says they need space every time you get too close. Not someone who's emotionally starving, then blames you for being hungry. You want healing? Then stop offering your heart to people who don't even know how to hold their own. Stop writing paragraphs to someone who gives you one-word answers. Stop justifying their silence as their way of processing. They're not processing, they're avoiding. And the longer you keep making excuses for them, the longer you stay stuck in this cycle where your pain becomes normal. Your nervous system is exhausted. Your mind is tired of trying to make sense of the mixed signals. One day you're everything. The next you're too much. One moment they're warm, present, I miss you. And the next they vanish like a ghost in the fog. And you think you're healing in that? No, you're surviving. You're in emotional purgatory hoping someone who avoids themselves can somehow hold you. But how can they? How can someone who runs from their own emotions hold space for yours? They won't. They'll drop you the moment you need more than they're capable of giving. And then you'll think it's your fault again. You'll spiral again. You'll apologize for feeling again until one day you finally ask yourself, why do I keep giving people the power to make me feel like I'm too hard to love? And the answer will shake you because you were trained to. You were trained to find crumbs and call it a feast. You were trained to think love must be earned. You were trained to believe that if you could just be better, they would stay. But they won't. Not because you're unworthy, but because they were never capable in the first place. You're not healing by staying in this. You're getting better at tolerating dysfunction. That's not strength, that's conditioning. You want to know what healing looks like? It looks like letting go. It looks like walking away even when your whole body is screaming to stay. It looks like holding your own hand through the loneliness. It looks like telling that inner child, we're done begging. Because healing doesn't happen in their arms. Healing happens the moment you stop putting your heart in hands that drop it every time they get uncomfortable. Healing happens when you realize that the love you've been fighting for from them is the love you've always needed from you. They will not save you. They will not complete you. They will not become the person you write about in your journal. And that's okay, because now it's your time. Your time to choose differently. Your time to stop seeking safety in danger zones. Your time to say, I'm not healing in this anymore. I'm breaking apart. And then you leave, not because you hate them, but because you finally love you more. You cannot heal in the arms of someone who keeps dropping you. You tried, and now it's time to stop trying. It's time to start healing for real. You weren't in love with them. You were addicted to the hope of being chosen. And that sentence will sting if you've ever stayed in a situation longer than your dignity could afford. You thought it was love because your heart raced when they texted, because the silence broke you, because every breadcrumb felt like a feast. But it wasn't love. It was the fantasy of love. The fantasy that if you just held on long enough, softened yourself enough, sacrificed your truth enough, maybe finally they would turn around, look at you and say, you're the one. But they never did. Not fully, not completely, not in the way you begged for in the quiet moments of your own loneliness, because what you were really craving wasn't their love. It was their approval, their validation, their recognition. You didn't want them. You wanted the version of yourself that felt worthy in their presence. That's not love. That's a drug. And like any drug, it hits hard, it fades fast, and it leaves you hollow. Because every moment they gave you hope, that flicker of attention, that compliment, that text at 2, MOME, it lit something up inside of you, and then it vanished again. And you were left chasing that high, that maybe, that whisper of potential that kept you hooked. They didn't choose you, but they didn't release you either. They gave you just enough to keep you guessing, but never enough to feel secure. And you mistook that confusion for depth. You told yourself they're just scared. They've been through a lot. They need time. But the truth? They were never planning on choosing you. They were using your hope as a cushion for their own emptiness. And you were handing it over like it was candy. You became addicted to the potential of what you could be if only they came around. You built castles out of moments. You read poetry into their indifference. You romanticized every delay, every withdrawal, every half-hearted miss you, like it was some divine signal that love was just around the corner, but it wasn't. And deep down, you knew what you were really doing was negotiating your own value. You kept making internal deals with yourself. If I just don't bring this up, maybe they'll stay. If I just show how understanding I am, maybe they'll come closer. If I can just keep proving that I'm the safe one, the loyal one, the ride or die, maybe they'll wake up and realize what they have. But they never woke up because they were never asleep. They knew what they were doing. They knew you'd stay, and you did. Not because you were weak, but because you were wounded. There's a difference. You were carrying an old story that said love must be earned, that you had to prove you were worth keeping, that you weren't allowed to have needs because needs made you a burden. So instead of asking for more, you swallowed your pain and smiled. And in doing that, you became addicted, not to them, but to the idea that their validation would fix everything broken inside you. That if they just finally saw your worth, it would erase the years of feeling unseen, unwanted, unloved. But it never did. Because even when they gave you scraps of attention, your soul stayed hungry, your heart stayed in pieces, and you called that love? Love is not supposed to feel like begging. Love is not a test where you suffer to prove your loyalty. Love is not a game where the prize is being tolerated. Love is not a war where you lose yourself just to feel close to someone who can't even say your name without hesitation. You were addicted to the idea that if they finally chose you, it would mean you're enough. But let me burn that illusion down right now. You were always enough. Before them, during them, after them, you just didn't believe it. And they didn't either, because they were never capable of seeing beyond their own avoidance, their own fear, their own inability to receive real love. You stayed because the hope was louder than the hurt, because the fantasy was stronger than the facts, because some part of you still believed that if they choose me, maybe I'll finally feel chosen by life itself. But the reality, you chose someone who didn't choose you. And the longer you stayed, the more you abandoned yourself. So let's tell the truth. You weren't in love with them. You were in love with the idea of being seen. You were in love with what it would mean about you if they finally stopped running. You were in love with the story, not the person. Because the person, they were inconsistent, emotionally unavailable, confusing. One day hot, the next day a ghost. And yet you clung to every micro moment of affection like it was proof of something greater. But real love doesn't leave you in pieces. Real love doesn't activate your abandonment wounds every 48 hours. Real love doesn't require you to twist yourself into silence just to avoid being too much. Real love doesn't make you prove yourself over and over again just to be acknowledged. The high of being almost chosen is one of the most dangerous addictions in the world because almost will eat you alive. Almost will have you sacrificing your joy, your dignity, your power, all in the name of one day maybe becoming enough for someone who doesn't even know how to hold themselves, let alone you. The most painful part isn't that they didn't choose you. It's that you kept hoping they would while you abandoned the one person who actually needed you the most, yourself. That's the betrayal that hurts the deepest. Not theirs, yours. The betrayal of your own heart in the name of being loved. So what now? You break the addiction. You stop chasing. You stop hoping they'll come around. You stop turning their scraps into stories. And you grieve not just the loss of them, but the loss of the illusion that they were ever going to save you. You grieve the version of you that believed love was something you had to earn by being small, quiet, accommodating. And then you rise. You start choosing yourself in the same way you begged them to choose you. You become the love you were waiting for. And you stop confusing the thrill of being almost loved with the peace of being fully, unapologetically seen. You said, expand key point 4 in 1,000 words, but don't pat headings or ending sentence and with full power reactions and speech. Do like reading like advice. ChatGPT said, you were never supposed to chase them. You were supposed to recognize the moment they ran and stop. Not plead, not bargain, not lose sleep over their confusion. You were supposed to see that their distance wasn't a mystery to solve. It was a message that said they are not available for the kind of love you deserve. And instead of listening, you sprinted harder. You fought harder. You called it love, but it was desperation disguised as loyalty. You saw them pulling away. Instead of backing up and protecting your peace, you leaned in with more text, more effort, more softness. You hoped that maybe, just maybe, if you loved them the right way, they'd come back. But people don't run from love. They run from responsibility. They run from emotional intimacy. They run from their own truth. And if someone runs from the real you, from your need to be seen, heard, and understood, then they are not your person. No matter how badly you want them to be, chasing them was never love. It was abandonment reactivation. It was your nervous system screaming that something familiar was happening, that old ache of being unseen, unheard, unheld, and your brain told you to fight for it. That if you could just fix this, maybe you wouldn't feel that old childhood wound again. Maybe you'd finally prove you're worth staying for. But that wasn't your job. Healing wasn't supposed to come through them. It was supposed to come through you. You gave more than they ever asked for. You offered your heart like a gift and they stared at it like it was an inconvenience. You apologized for your needs. You softened your voice. You became emotionally palatable so they wouldn't run further. And it still wasn't enough. And that's where you keep getting stuck. You think that if you change, they will stay. But you're changing into someone unrecognizable to yourself, and they're still leaving. Still cold, still emotionally bankrupt. You think it's about effort. You think if you just show them how loyal, kind, available you are, they'll finally choose you. But people don't choose you because of your effort. People choose you because they are emotionally ready, because they are present, because they want to. Not because you fought harder, they saw your heart, they knew how much you cared. They knew the way you stayed up at night worrying. They felt the warmth in your voice when they needed someone. They experienced your emotional presence and still chose to keep their distance. That is not your fault. That is a reflection of their emotional limitations, not your value. You think you're being strong by holding on, but real strength is walking away when your soul is begging for rest. Real strength is recognizing when the chase is killing you. Real strength is putting the energy you spent on chasing back into yourself, back into your healing, back into the parts of you that kept breaking just to keep the connection alive. There's a part of you that's terrified to stop reaching, to stop caring more than they do. Because what happens if you stop? That part fears you'll lose them, that they'll forget you, that they'll replace you. And here's the honest truth. Maybe they will, but you won't be the one who lost. You'll be the one who finally chose peace over performance. You were never supposed to prove you were worthy of love. Love doesn't come with tests. Love doesn't keep you waiting in limbo. Love doesn't require you to chase it down the hallway begging it to come back. The chase is a trauma loop. It's the illusion that the more exhausted you are, the more deserving you become. But exhaustion is not a badge of honor in relationships. You shouldn't feel like you're in a war zone every time you express a feeling. You shouldn't feel like your entire identity revolves around fixing a connection that never felt safe to begin with. You kept giving because deep down, you were hoping they'd see the depth of your love and finally stay. But someone who's not emotionally available doesn't see depth. They feel pressure. They translate your presence as a threat to their independence. Your needs as demands. Your closeness as suffocation. Not because you're wrong, but because they're not ready. And yet you stayed and chased and gave and waited. You watered a desert hoping for roses. You poured yourself out hoping they'd finally fill the cup. And all that did was drain you. And let's be honest, even when they stayed physically, they weren't there. You were alone in the relationship. You were the emotional anchor, the safe space, the healer, the mirror, the fixer. And they just existed, took up space in your heart without paying rent. When you stop chasing, everything changes. Your worth starts rising. Your standards start building. Your intuition stops being ignored because in the silence of not chasing, you hear your real voice. The voice that says, I deserve to be chosen without begging. The voice that says, I don't have to break just to feel loved. The voice that says, if I have to lose myself to keep someone, then I've already lost. There's no reward at the end of the chase, no pot of gold, no fairy tale ending where they finally realize your worth and love you the way you begged them to. That story is a lie told to you by your trauma. What really happens, you wear yourself out, lose your glow, and finally collapse. Not because they left, but because you never left them. You never left the illusion. You kept chasing something that wasn't even moving towards you. But the moment you stop, the moment you pause the chase, even for a breath, you feel it. The power coming back. The pieces of you that were spread across texts, voice notes, waiting, hoping, they return. You remember that your love is a gift, that your presence is a privilege, that your energy is sacred. You were never meant to run after someone who walks away at the first sign of real connection. You were meant to rise, to stand still in your truth and let the ones who are capable of meeting you there find you. You were meant to receive, not just give, to be held, not just hold, to be cherished, not just tolerated. You weren't supposed to chase them. You were supposed to heal the part of you that thought you had to. They didn't reject you. They rejected responsibility. And you've been carrying that like it says something about your worth, like their inability to love you in a real, consistent, healthy way means you weren't lovable. Like their distance was a direct reflection of your value. But let me break this open. They didn't walk away because you were too much. They walked away because you were real. And real requires presence. Real requires emotional labor. Real requires showing up. They weren't ready for real. So they ran. And you internalized that. You made it about you. You stood in front of their silence and said, what did I do wrong? You turned their absence into a mirror and used it to attack your own reflection. You questioned your worth, your energy, your vulnerability. But the truth is, they didn't leave because you loved too loud. They left because they were never ready to echo it back. They didn't walk because you were broken. They walked because they were unprepared to carry the weight of your truth. You didn't get rejected. You got revealed. What you thought was a relationship was actually a hiding place for their avoidance. What you thought was connection was really convenience. It was the safe zone for them to dip their toes into your warmth without ever stepping into the deep end. And the second the water got too deep, too vulnerable, too honest, they bailed. They disappeared behind excuses. I'm just not in a place for this. I need to focus on myself. I don't know what I want. And every one of those statements felt like a dagger. But listen close. Those weren't daggers of truth. They were shields. They weren't pushing you away because you were unworthy. They were protecting themselves from the work that love requires. They weren't rejecting you. They were rejecting growth. They were rejecting intimacy. They were rejecting the mirror you held up that said, here I am, all of me. Can you handle that? And the answer was no, they couldn't. Because to love you would have meant confronting their own patterns, their own wounds, their own emotional malnourishment. And they weren't ready to do that. They weren't ready to sit in the fire of connection and be transformed by it. So they ran. And still, you stayed in that story. The story that said, if you were different, they would have stayed. That if you hadn't texted so much, hadn't asked for clarity, hadn't shown how much you cared, they might have stuck around, but that's the lie. That's the hook. That's the trauma voice whispering it's your fault. But it's not. The truth is, you showed up fully, deeply, brave, vulnerable, and they couldn't meet you. That's not rejection. That's misalignment. They couldn't hold what you carry. They couldn't receive what you give. And instead of admitting that, they left you questioning everything because that's easier for them. Easier than facing the shame of their own emptiness. Easier than saying, I don't know how to love at the level you deserve. So they let you take the fall, let you drown in the silence, let you wonder why they pulled away instead of being honest enough to admit that they never had the capacity in the first place. They weren't rejecting you. They were avoiding accountability. They didn't want to be the one who had to rise, the one who had to show up with more than just charm and chemistry. You demanded emotional maturity. You demanded clarity. You demanded real presence. And they didn't have it, not because you asked too much, but because they had too little to give. You think you were abandoned, but what actually happened was the universe removed someone who wasn't capable of loving you at the level you're destined for. You think you were left behind, but what actually happened is you were redirected out of the illusion, out of the almost, out of the hunger, because you deserve fullness. You never lost love. You lost the illusion of love. You lost someone who couldn't hold your intensity, and that's a win. That's protection. That's the clearing before the real thing arrives. But you've got to stop interpreting their absence as proof of your unworthiness. You've got to stop collecting evidence against yourself from people who were never qualified to judge your value. You don't hand your self-worth to someone who flinches at emotional closeness. You don't let someone who avoids their own heart be in charge of yours. You think their walking away is something you need to fix? But it's not your job to turn avoidant people into emotionally available ones. It's not your mission to become more digestible just to be loved. You're not too much. They're too unavailable. You're not broken. They're emotionally asleep. You're not dramatic. They're disconnected. And your sensitivity, that's not weakness. That's your gift. That's your compass. That's your truth, screaming to be honored. You need to start seeing their rejection for what it is. Divine protection from a half love. A love that would have made you question your enoughness every single day. A love that would have kept you chasing, performing, shrinking. And no matter how pretty that fantasy was, the reality would have ruined you. You didn't fail. You showed up. You opened your heart. You leaned in. You loved hard. And the other person couldn't meet you there. That is not rejection. That is clarity. That is your wake-up call to stop handing first-class love to people flying coach on emotional responsibility. You were looking for connection and they were looking for escape. You were building a future and they were building an exit plan. You were ready for depth and they couldn't even swim. That doesn't mean you're unlovable. It means you were speaking a language they refused to learn. So stop blaming yourself for their fear. Stop shrinking yourself to fit inside someone else's avoidance. Stop translating their emotional absence into a wound you need to heal. Let their silence be the teacher. Let their leaving be the lesson. Let their inability to choose you become your invitation to choose yourself harder than you ever have before. Because that rejection, that wasn't about you. That was about everything they weren't ready to face. And your healing, it starts the moment you stop trying to decode their behavior and start reclaiming your power. You keep thinking the pain is punishment, but the pain is a portal. You keep asking, why did I go through that? As if it was sent to break you, but it wasn't. It was sent to wake you up, to shake you out of the fantasy, to snap you out of the illusion that you were going to get safety, connection, and unconditional love from someone who didn't even feel safe in their own body. That heartbreak didn't destroy you. It delivered you. Because the moment the avoidant walked away, the illusion burned down. And in that fire, you found something you never expected, the mirror of your own becoming. You didn't lose a person. You lost a pattern. You lost a habit of self-abandonment. You lost a relationship that was teaching you to doubt your voice, question your intuition, and minimize your needs. And in the wreckage of that story, there was something sacred left behind. You. Not the you that was trying to be liked, trying to be accepted, trying to hold it all together, but the real you, the wild one, the honest one, the one who's done settling for half-hearted connection and breadcrumb love. That version of you was born in the pain. That's not suffering. That's alchemy. You think you broke, but you cracked open, and now there's light pouring through those fractures. You feel everything, the rage, the grief, the loneliness, and that makes you alive. You feel your heart beating again, even though it's bruised. You feel your intuition screaming now, louder than ever, because you stopped silencing it for someone else's comfort. You thought you needed them to feel whole, but it was their absence that finally made you remember how powerful you are. Every tear you cried was a sacred baptism. Every night you spent asking, "What's wrong with me?" was a gateway to the question you really needed to ask. What's been disconnected inside me that allowed me to stay this long? That's the question that saves lives. That's the question that ends the cycle. Because once you realize that your nervous system mistook anxiety for chemistry, that your heart thought inconsistency meant excitement, you start rewiring from the inside out. You stop calling chaos love. You stop calling distance mystery. You stop calling hot and cold romantic tension. You see it for what it is. Unavailability dressed in charm. Emotional immaturity wearing a mask of confidence. And once you see it, you can never unsee it again. That's the gift. That's the rebirth. You become the version of yourself that doesn't chase, not because you're bitter, but because you're awake. You realize that self-love is not a quote on Instagram. It's a revolution. It's how you speak to yourself after they ghost you. It's how you hold your heart when it's aching at 2 a.m. It's how you say, "I know what I deserve," and actually mean it when someone shows up with a halfway effort. Self-love isn't bubble baths and positive affirmations. It's choosing yourself when it's the hardest thing to do. This pain carved out space for your standards. It dug deep into the old roots and pulled out everything that wasn't serving you. All the beliefs that told you love has to be earned, fought for, proven. All the internalized noise that told you your needs were too much, your voice too loud, your heart too intense. This pain burned it down. And now you stand in the ashes with your hands open saying, "I'm ready for more, but this time it has to be real." You've changed. The version of you that tolerated the chase, that normalized being ignored, that thought love was supposed to feel like a performance, that version is gone, buried, dead. What's here now is something fiercer, something wiser, someone who can spot avoidance a mile away, someone who doesn't settle for potential anymore, someone who doesn't build a home out of maybe. You don't want promises, you want presence. You don't want charm, you want character. You don't want intensity that burns out in 2 weeks, you want intimacy that lasts. You didn't just survive this pain. You evolved through it. It stretched you. It broke the parts of you that were built from childhood wounds. And now you get to rebuild from truth. You get to rewire your nervous system to recognize peace as attraction. You get to redefine love as something safe, sacred, and mutual, not something you have to audition for. It doesn't matter if they come back. It doesn't matter if they miss you. What matters is you're not who you were when they left. You've seen too much now. You've felt the weight of your own heart, and you've held it without dropping it. That's real. That's rare. That's warrior energy. No avoidant partner, no confusing situationship, no breadcrumb connection is strong enough to break someone who has learned how to hold themselves in the fire. You're not looking to be saved anymore. You're not waiting for someone to finally get it. You get it. You see it. You see that the real work isn't making them stay. It's making sure you never abandon yourself again, that you never trade your peace for attachment, that you never settle just because you're scared to start over. You're not bitter. You're brilliant. You're not angry. You're aligned. You're not lost. You're liberated. And now that the fog is gone, you get to walk into the world with eyes that don't lie to you. You get to meet new people and feel it instantly. Is this safe? Is this real? Is this someone who can meet me? And if the answer is no, you'll walk, not because you're cold, but because you're clear. That's what the pain gave you. Clarity, power, wisdom, depth. You're not afraid of your feelings anymore. You're not numbing. You're not hiding. You're healing. You're facing it all. And in doing so, you're becoming someone no avoidant could ever handle because you're no longer addicted to being chosen. You choose you again and again. You used to think closure meant getting answers from them, but now you know closure is when you decide the story is over. When you stop needing their validation to believe in your value. When you stop rereading the texts, replaying the moments, trying to find the exact second it all broke. It broke because it wasn't built on truth. And now you are. So let the pain do its work. Let it sculpt you into someone who no longer tolerates half love. Let it rebuild your standards from sacred ground. Let it remind you day by day that the greatest relationship you'll ever have is the one where you never leave yourself again. Because that's where the real love begins. Not when they finally come back, but when you come home to yourself.